So I'm going to go to my records.php. I'm going to start out with standard PHP tags. And let's consider for a second what we're going to want this file to contain. We want to have it display a form to the user that allows them to provide us data to be entered into the database. We want to provide some sort of functionality to indicate to the user if there's an issue with the form. Maybe they forgot to fill in a form field. And we obviously want to have PHP code to process this form and either update the database or add a new record to the database. So how we're going to approach this is we're going to, if you go back to view records briefly, you'll notice if you hover over the edit link down at the bottom here, you'll notice when we edit files, it's going to go to records.php with an ID value. And if you want to add a new record, it'll just go to regular records.php. So that's primarily how we're going to structure things in terms of telling PHP what we want this file to do. So let me very briefly show you. So I'm going to do if is set, and we're going to check if the ID variable is set. And just for demonstration's sake, okay, so this will check if the ID is set, it'll display a message. If it's not set, it'll display a different message. So let me just save this and preview and I'll show you. So it says the ID is set. You'll notice ID is set here. Or if we go back and do add new record, ID is not set because nothing is sent via the URL. Okay, so back to functionality here. One thing that we're going to want to do is we probably want to create a function that'll display this form, because we're going to want to display this form in multiple ways. We want to display it if the user is entering a new record, if he's updating the existing record. We need to display it in case there are errors, and we need to let the user know that there are issues with the form. So I'm going to put this in a function. We call it render form. And when we call this function, I'm going to send it some bits of data. We want to send it a variable called first, last, error in case there are any error messages, and finally ID. Okay, and my setting each of these equal to nothing means that these are defaults. So for example, we could call this function like this, and it would be fine because we have default values for each of these parameters. We could also include data in it. For example, Ben, my last name Falk. There we go. And when we call this form, first would then equal Ben, and the last name would then equal Falk because it overrides these default values. So it just makes things a little bit simpler. Instead of having to do something like this, where we send blank values for each of these parameters, we can ignore this, set the default, and just use a standard form like this. Okay, so back to our form. Let's go ahead and include standard HTML tags. Excuse me. And let's close out the PHP tags. There we go. Okay, so this is the start of our form. The title, how we're going to determine is if the ID value is set, we know that we're editing an existing record. If the ID value is not set, if it equals nothing, we know we're going to be adding a new record. So I'm going to include PHP here. I'm going to say if ID does not equal nothing, we're going to echo out edit record. And otherwise, we're going to echo out new record. So that sets that up. Now within the body, let's add an h1 tag, and similar thing, well, I can just copy and paste this. Okay, so that's in place. And now let's go ahead and display any errors. So if this error variable is set, we need to display them. So if that, and we're going to include each of these errors in a small div. So we want to echo out and I'm just going to add a little bit of styling to it. 4 pixels and a border. Okay, so that's the start of our div, and then we want to include the error variable, and then finally the closing div. Okay, so that's going to take care of that. We need to close this off here. Okay, so we have h1 tag set. We display errors if the error variable has been set, and then finally we need to actually display the form itself. So form action, we can just leave this blank so it redirects to the same page, and we're going to use the post method. Now within this form, we'll wrap everything in a div. And then include PHP. So if the ID variable does not equal nothing, so similar to what we've been doing up here, I also want to include a message to the user showing what the ID of the record the user is editing. So let's close this out. We're going to include a hidden field here. With a value, or excuse me, a name of ID and a value of ID. And this ensures that when the form gets submitted, we can grab this information. Okay, so we got that portion. And then we also want to display the message I was talking about. And we're going to do ID. Actually, I can just copy and paste this here. Okay. So that section is set. So we start the form. If the ID is set up here, we know that we are editing a record, and we're going to include a hidden field which has the ID value, and also we're going to display the ID to the user. And then for fields that display whether we're editing or adding a new record, so first name, and I'm just using the star to indicate it's a required field. strong, and then input. So it's a type of text. Name is first name. And the value, if we're editing the page, if we're editing a record, we want this value to equal first. So like so. So that's one input, and then I'll just copy and paste this. And this will become the last name. And last. And we want to indicate to the user that the star means required, so they can't forget to fill that field in. And then finally, a submit button.